The anomalies in creation, geniuses, go toe-to-toe with the orchestrators of the universe, the talented learners, in a fight like none you've seen thus far. The ultimate battle between the two ultimate life forms that dominate our world. A fight that far extends beyond Blue Lock and defines excellence in real life. And so, in today's video, we are going to dive deeper into what makes each group tick, and we are going to figure out each team's weapons, strength, and their weaknesses in order to define who truly dominates Blue Lock. Now, before we start, I gotta say that I've never done something like this. Usually when I do a player versus a player matchup, I go over each opponent individually, talk about their physicalities, their weapons, their feats, and in doing so, I always try to stray from bringing the other side or sides as much as possible. That way, we keep the spicy stuff until the end. However, this time it's obviously going to be different, and as such, I will be splitting the video into only two parts. First, I will be exploring the two types of players. I will start with the talented learners, but I will be bringing the geniuses as counterpoint all the times. Then I will be doing the opposite. I will explain the geniuses and present the talented learners as counterpoints when needs be. From there, part 2 is going to be how the matchup would go and who will be the winner. And so, without any further ado, let's start by defining what makes a talented learner. Now, immediately, in order for me to explain this, I gotta make a disclaimer. You see, in Blue Lock, geniuses are often regarded as the anomalies of the show. However, talented learners are also anomalies if you think about it. In fact, a deeper look would reveal that talented learners are a special case to being a genius. You see, what the writer of Blue Lock did is actually split things between the talented learners and the geniuses, despite them being two faces to the same coin, despite them both being very special humans. And something that I don't like, and I've seen it times and times again in the community, is that people regard Isagi as only smart, as if that by definition makes him a talented learner. However, think about it. Isn't Isagi insanely high IQ an anomaly in of itself? Doesn't this automatically makes him a genius as much as Rin? Sure, Rin's anomaly is very different from Isagi's, but at the end of the day, they are both insanely smart on the pitch, and that's their ultimate power. That's what I'm talking about. Being a talented learner doesn't mean you are a simpleton who is just smart. In fact, it means you are very special because you are that smart. And to drive this point home, I gotta give you guys a very clear example. You see, in the first game of the third selection, Nanase found himself in a dilemma. No matter what he tried to do, he never was able to understand what Chido and Rin were doing on the pitch, which was the case for the two guys from the other team. They could not begin to understand what Chido and Rin were doing, and so they failed miserably in defending against them. And so to me, this immediately signals that these three are neither geniuses nor talented learners. Because if we look at the other geniuses, Chigiri and Otoya, they were doing just fine. And on the opposite spectrum, so were the talented learners. Karasu, Isagi, and Hiyori found great success despite Chido and Rin's presence. And that's the distinctions. Nanase and the other two guys are normal human beings, while Isagi, Hiyori, and Karasu are talented learners. And of course, Chigiri, Shido, Otoya, and Rin are geniuses. And now that we actually know that talented learners are also very special people, we can begin to define them. You see, it boils down to one thing. The difference between geniuses and talented learners is strictly in the way they think. It's not about the anomalies they possess, and it's not about what they can do. I mean, physically speaking, Aiko is one of the most dominant players, yet to me he is one of the most extreme talented learners. And that again boils down to the way he thinks, which is completely different from someone like Aryu or Kunigami, who are dominant in the air as well. And so, what am I talking about here? How can we distinguish a talented learner's way of thinking? Well, it is actually very simple. Talented learners are exclusively adaptive, unlike geniuses who are purely irregular and unpredictable. Talented learners, on the other hand, are all about analyzing, understanding, then adapting, countermeasuring, and finally acting on what they deducted. That's what defines a talented learner at the end. And that's why it's always been easy for them to explain how their goal came through, simply because they always favor goals being well constructed over being flashy. And make no mistake here, talented learners, much like geniuses, have variations, and some like to show off more than others. Case in point is Snuffy, who is the best in the world and doesn't try to prove it, while we have Prince, whose whole existence is about proving that he is him. In fact, Chris Prince is the perfect character to talk about here in order to fully explain what a talented learner is. And here I gotta do a shameless plug and urge you guys to watch this video from me, because it will help you understand the distinction between being a talented learner versus a genius. Furthermore, it will explain how these are not extremes, but rather most players like Chris Prince fall on a spectrum. In any case, however, the reason I want to talk about Chris Prince specifically is because the way he thinks is not necessarily that of a smart person. However, it is definitely that of a talented learner. Which, don't get me wrong, Prince is definitely one of the smartest players we've seen. However, he obviously doesn't compare to the likes of Snuffy, Karasu, Isigi, and even a genius like Noah. However, his thought process is the same. He saw what football is. He adapted to it by figuring out how to eliminate all weaknesses he has. And then he simply acted upon this realization and went to take on the world. Which means the way a talented learner constructs a play doesn't necessarily require insane tactics. And Chris Prince is the biggest example of this. His solution to fighting geniuses is actually to eliminate any weakness against them. He has the best physicality and he is the best at almost any aspect of Blue Lock, with the exception to field readability and perception. And on the topic of being different, I think Kaiser is also quite different from the other talented learners like Isigi, Snuffy, and Hiyori. And that's because he doesn't embrace tactics that much. To him, it's all about forcing a goal with his insane weapons that he developed after adapting to what must be done. And I think at this point, I should note that adaptability is not exclusive to Isigi. Every talented learner excels at adaptability. However, it varies between different players. And Isigi and Ryo are the absolute extremes when it comes to adaptability. And funny enough, Snuffy is the exact opposite. While being probably the smartest talented learner, his adaptability is rather low compared to the likes of Charles and Isigi. Because you see, all of his tactics, despite being insane and almost infinite, they are all based on numbers and on data. And as we've seen in the Uber's game, when it comes to the highest of levels, most tactics fails and improvisation needs to be introduced. That's why pairing him with Baro specifically was a perfect move, because having to deal with a genius with the most unpredictability is something that required Snuffy to reawaken his adaptability, to reawaken his ability to imagine different scenarios and how they would change depending on how the game goes. And obviously, as you can tell, I am talking a lot about this, because to me this is peak Blue Lock. Blue Lock for me peaked in the PXG game when Isigi made the distinction between a talented learner and a genius. Simply because understanding how one thinks is the first step into success. Much like Isigi found it impossible to face geniuses the way they face him, one must realize how his thought process goes, and depending on how he thinks, he must act. And so again, I truly love this about Blue Lock. However, now that we actually established how talented learners think, one must ask, why do they think the way they do? I mean, for instance, why they are different than geniuses. If geniuses like Ren or Noah could be insanely smart on the pitch, what differentiates them from the likes of Isigi and Kaiser? Well, it's actually simple. It all revolves around how they see the world. You see, due to their adaptive nature, talented learners often begin as very average humans, like it happened with Isigi, Karasu, and Hiyori, and only after adapting multiple times they could see the world for what it is. On the other hand, due to the irregular nature of geniuses, most of them grow up to be very unique. And I'm not saying this as a positive, it is actually neither a positive nor negative. Many geniuses struggle because they are so unique, and many geniuses are praised for the same reason. However, think about it. For geniuses, everything comes from within. Their anomalies is what set them apart. Their anomalies dictate how they view the world. On the other hand, because geniuses grow up to be very average, the way the world seems is what dictates how they think. One side of the coin thinks that in order to succeed in life, you need to attain recognizable results, while the other type finds only joy in beating challenges set by themselves. Case in point, Noah and Bajira, of course. However, and going back to talented learners, I think it's time for us to explore certain weapons that are very common among them. And I've already alluded to two, which is being super smart and also being very adaptive. And again here, even among talented learners, there are a lot of differences between the characters. Snuffy being extremely smart, while Isigi being extremely adaptive. However, there is another weapon that I think the majority of talented learners share, which is metavision. And in fact, to me personally, I feel like metavision is the expression of being a talented learner. It is a weapon that allows the talented learner to fully utilize his big brain. Someone who is not extremely smart cannot handle metavision. And in fact, metavision is a weapon that, even though right now it seems very common, it has one of the highest barriers of entry among any weapon in Duel, simply because one must be extremely smart in order to fully utilize it. However, because metavision relays a lot of information, the adaptability of the player dictates how strong that metavision is, because it dictates how fast that player can come up with answers to whatever situation happening around him. And it is for that reason why Isigi is dominating with his metavision. And by the way here, not every talented learner is required to have metavision. I feel like it is a very broad weapon that most talented learners need to acquire it. However, there are other players like Chris Prince, for example, who doesn't necessarily need metavision, because you see, through his hard work and through his thinking, he became the most overpowered player one-on-one. He became the most threatening player on the pitch. However, enough about metavision. Let's actually move to the final weapon that the talented learners share. You see, because most talented learners grow up to be very average, they were required to have insane social skills in order to survive. They were required to learn to play with other kids in order to survive in any given society, unlike geniuses again who are completely outcast. And I feel like because metavision was such an oppressive weapon, Isigi felt as if he can go toe-to-toe with geniuses. He found success against Baro, against Nagi, and he tried the same thing against Ren, where the latter really showed him what it means to be a genius. However, after what Noah told him, it made Isigi notice something, that he doesn't need to fight alone. He does not need to fight like geniuses do. At the end of the day, he is a talented learner, and so he approached Kaiser and together they teamed up, which only works this easily because Kaiser is a talented learner. And it's not just that. If you think about it, every talented learner we've seen excels at being a team player, and so that's the final weapon I want to talk about regarding talented learners. However, next, let's shift gear and talk about the geniuses. And again, let's start by defining what a genius is. Now, in the realm of Blue Lock, being a genius has nothing to do with being extremely smart. I mean, being extremely smart is part of being a genius, but also it includes being super fast, super strong, and extremely creative. However, if I had to pinpoint what defines a genius, I would say it is definitely his irregularity and his unpredictability. A genius is defined by how volatile he can be all of a sudden. A genius needs only few triggers in order to unexpectedly mutate and achieve a higher level. That to me is what defines a genius, which again is the complete opposite of a talented learner who has to build everything brick by brick. However, this means that their mutations are often unstable. Someone like Ren, who can become one of the most dominant U20 players in the show, doesn't regularly access his strongest state. And that's actually in complete contrast with the likes of Isigi and Kaiser, whom once they acquire a weapon, it will be always in their arsenal. Geniuses, on the other hand, because they mutate violently, not even they themselves can control their mutations. And often this leads into varying levels of success. Case in point is Nagi, of course, and Rin, as I said before. And I know there are players who can control their mutations, like Noah for example. And here actually, unlike talented learners, geniuses are not defined by their mentality. They are of course defined by their egos, but it differs from a player to a player. However, and even though most of them think very highly of themselves and their abilities due to the way they saw the world when growing up, this mentality still doesn't define them necessarily, as being unpredictable defines them far better than this. In any case, however, now that we establish what defines a genius, let's actually talk about their insane weapons. Now, I am going to lump all of the physical abilities into one category and talk about how insane physicality is typically the weapon that the genius's core playing style revolves around. And this could be strength, speed, agility, or even jumping ability. Hell, sometimes it's even their shooting ability. And in fact, this is the reason why Kaiser is on a spectrum and being very close to being a genius at the same time as being a talented learner. In fact, Kaiser presents the second weapon that is typically associated with geniuses, which we will get to in a second. First, I want to say that being physically gifted doesn't even begin to describe geniuses. Their prowess and dominance over the physical aspects is honestly no joke. Someone like Loki is considered one of the best at the age of 17 simply because he is that fast. And so one of the easiest weapons to pinpoint when it comes to geniuses is definitely their physicality, with Bunny being the latest example. Next, I want to talk about their perception. You see, while talented learners have metavision, most geniuses who have insane field IQ tend to have insane perception that cannot be explained by anything. Someone like Lorenzo has no business keeping up with Kaiser and his metavision. In fact, he did not just keep up with it, he completely decimated him. If after the Uber's game you go to Lorenzo and asks him about his thought process and how he stopped Kaiser, I would guarantee it he would say one of two things: that he was following in Snuffy's tactics, or he simply doesn't know. He just did what he could and completely decimated Kaiser. And I feel like the biggest examples of this are definitely Rin and Noah. They don't need metavision because they can do it just like that. They are geniuses just like that. And speaking of Kaiser, the next weapon I want to talk about is the Predator Eyes. You see, because most geniuses are solely focused on scoring, the Predator Eyes are a weapon that help them into translating their genius into goals. Simple as that. And finally, I want to talk about their strongest weapon, which is their unpredictability. You see, as I said in their description, they are defined by their ability to mutate. They are defined by their ability to go beyond what everyone is thinking. And this actually brings me to why they are outcasts. Because let's face it, with the exception of Otoye and Chiguri, all the geniuses in Blue Lock are complete douchebags and are characters that are happy being alone. Case in point, someone like Bachiro, who at first might seem to be a very nice guy, only to discover that that's only a disguise. He is as solitaire as Ren, Shido, or Baro. However, and going back to their unpredictability, in a society that is all about rules and about law, and in a society that values tangible results, being a genius is rather hard on the person, because not only are their ideas are very ahead of their times, they also lack the social capability to explain their ideas. And something very interesting here. In real life, geniuses struggle specifically due to this reason. However, in football, they shine very high. This unpredictability of theirs is very useful when it comes to football, as it always gives them an edge when it comes to scoring any goal. However, I feel like that's all we've got when it comes to geniuses. And so, between the talented learners and geniuses, who would win the fight? Now, for how it would go, it's honestly very tricky, and I spent a lot of time thinking of how to go about this, because we cannot compare the individuals here, and beyond that, we don't typically have any way of determining who is better. However, because we are talking about Blue Lock specifically, and because it is a very competitive sports manga, I feel like the best way to tackle this is about thinking of success. Which group is more successful than the other, and also which group should be more influential to any given environment. And I think by saying things out loud like this, it kinda gives a clue of who wins this battle. To me, and because we are talking about football and Blue Lock specifically, I think geniuses are definitely better than talented learners. And that's because due to their insane mutations, they are often the most dominant players. And as such, they are always the ones changing the sports. And it's actually rare for any given talented learner to be the one pushing the horizons of football. In fact, we know this because Ego specifically said that. Ego said that geniuses are the one to introduce new ideas. However, because they are extremely special, it is hard for everyone else to grasp what they are doing. And in that moment, the talented learners come, they adapt to the geniuses, construct countermeasures, and then elevate in football after the geniuses have already changed it. Which means geniuses will always be in the lead role, and the talented learners are simply reactors to whatever the geniuses could do. And I know in this they actually rival the geniuses, however, because they are the ones leading, I think the geniuses should win. And I definitely don't think that the talented learners deserve the win simply because Isigi, the protagonist, is one. In fact, I have another angle to look at this, because I hear you asking, how are geniuses better where we have the best player in the world, Snuffy, being a talented learner, and the true best player in Blue Lock right now, Isigi Yoichi, is also a talented learner? Well, look at it from this perspective. If we look at the pros that were selected by Ego for being the best at what they do, we find that the talented learners are actually the minority. We only have three: Prince, Snuffy, and Cavasauce. And even though these three are very dominant, they are not overpowering the geniuses whatsoever. On Snuffy's level we have Noah, on Prince's level we have Levy and Loki, and of course on Cavasos's level we have Luna, Silva and Blake. And if you actually notice from this, the geniuses outnumber the talented learners. And actually this is true even for the U20 category. Even though 3 of the best players in that category are talented learners, Isigi, Saiyan, Kaiser, we actually have 3 geniuses who are on their level, Lorenzo, Bunny and of course Ren. However, if we look deeper, we find that it is the geniuses that are mostly dominating. And I'm specifically talking about the second tier after this one, being totally comprised of 3 geniuses, Baro, Shido and Bajira. And from this you can see that geniuses are typically more successful than talented learners in football specifically. And because they are the ones driving the force, I think the W would go to the geniuses, no question. And as I said, in the context of Blue Lock, it's not even close. However, if we take things into real life, we find that talented learners are more successful than geniuses IRL. And that's because typically geniuses are outcasts, and their ideas don't fit necessarily with societies. And often it takes a talented learner to explain the genius idea to the public for them to accept it. And so in real life, talented learners are far more successful than geniuses. However, and because we are talking about sports here, and because we are talking about Blue Lock, geniuses are definitely better than talented learners. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.